Welcome to the Private Practice Survival Guide podcast with your host, Brandon Seigel. I'm a published author, speaker, entrepreneur, and private practice strategist dedicated to transforming the way that healthcare functions. This podcast is all about empowering you to create the change you want to see. Let's dive in. Thank you for tuning into this episode. Today, we're talking about determining your private practice growth trajectory. You know, I think so much of us, we get stuck in everyday routine that we forget to look forward. And part of our job is to see our potential. So I always say it this way, like if you look at your child, do you see what they do today or do you look at what they can do tomorrow? There's so much opportunity and we just don't know how to get there. And so I think one of the things we got to do is we need to plan for growth. And I'm a huge believer that slow growth is better than quick growth. And I've talked about this before, but I just want you to recognize that there are times where you get opportunities and you're not measuring the risk of that growth. And I find that slow growth can often get you more consistent sustainability because here's the deal. You are at $1 million of revenue a year. And all of a sudden, you get offered this opportunity and someone says, look, I've got 6 clinics. I want to roll them up. And you're able to get from 1 million to 5 million. You may not have the infrastructure to support that growth. And although that jump to $5 million, there is a world where you may actually lose money. What if you're making 250 grand off $1 million right now? And what if moving from 1 million to 5 million cost you 500,000 in lost revenue? Meaning that you had an overhead expense because what if you actually were getting the wrong thing? So it's so funny because I recently looked at a practice to acquire. And in this practice that I was about to acquire, um, I recognized that although it was 2.5 million of revenue acquisition, the liability was so great that I actually had greater risk of losing the margin I had now. It didn't make sense. Trying to buy money without money left over makes no sense. Their margins couldn't operate at my margins based on patient demographic, insurance contracts, and structure. And at a certain point, when I looked at restructuring everything, I recognized that the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. So when you're looking at your growth potential, growth trajectory, is the juice worth the squeeze? So as we look at strategies for planning in growth, I want you to define clear goals and metrics. I want you to look at what those measurables are. What are we trying to accomplish? What is our year over year growth? What's our patient volume, our revenue? And where is that benchmark in our current operating basis? How can we measure what growth should look like versus what growth does look like? So I want you to do a look back period. What did growth look like? Hey, we had a growth rate of this. And I need you to recognize something. The smaller you are, the more rapid growth will be. So when I have one employee and I add another employee, I just grew 100%. Oh my God. But what we need to recognize in our growth strategy is what is growth stability look like? What is month over month growth? What is year over year growth? What is 5-year over 5-year growth? How do we stabilize that? What is our growth potential? What is our growth sustainability? What is the market penetration opportunity? And how does that affect our bottom line? And so as we look at these measurable goals, we're going to use KPIs like new client acquisition. We're going to look at our retention. We're going to look at our average revenue per patient to track progress. Because what if you were to grow only to recognize the value of each patient went down, your expense per patient went up, your outcomes were actually in the negative. So you actually bought growth that hurt your practice. And by growth, I don't mean acquisition of a practice. I'm saying you bought growth through, hey, I opened another location, I used marketing, etc. So when we're planning, We want to analyze our current performance so that we have a baseline to sustain what is working in our practice. Assess your practice's current state. Review those financials. Review your patient demographics. Look at your referral sources. Tools like your profit and loss, your patient management software can highlight trends, and sometimes it can even bring improvement. So, one of the things that I realized when I was looking at acquiring that practice was that the patient census they had was not my ideal patient census. The patient census they had was a high need and it was a low revenue opportunity. And so the burn rate was low, but the margin was unsustainable. What's your burn rate? When you acquired a patient, how long you held on to them. They held on to patients for like years and years and years, but it took so long to earn back that margin. It just really was not, it didn't pencil. And so looking at that growth, does the growth pencil? And so when my financial planner said to me, "Oh, dude, that's great. I love that you're looking at this." And I was like, "Yeah, because I have this great group that helps oversee all of my financial growth opportunities. Um, and they're incredible. Shout out to Econologics. They did not ask me to plug them, but they're incredible. But they actually went through with me and we went through all the numbers. And at first they're like, Brandon, like you're going to acquire $2.5 million of growth. Like, let's make this happen. This is a hop, skip, and a jump, really cheap money to buy because we were buying money. That's what we were buying. Organic growth would net me more over the course of 18 months than acquiring this practice. I'm going to say it again. Organic growth was more valuable than acquiring growth. So looking at that is really important and understanding your market demand, researching your local market needs, understanding competition, identifying underserved niches, but why are they underserved? Are they underserved because of a supply and demand? Are they underserved because of margin? Because I've looked at 2 acquisitions in the last 6 months. Both acquisitions that I looked at were serving underserved areas. Why were they underserved? Why do you think? They were underserved because there wasn't enough meat on the bone. Why were they wanting to get out of it? The juice wasn't worth the squeeze. That's the truth. Now, you want to be on the mission and you want to squeeze all that juice and it's worth it to you on an emotional level, great. More power to you. But I couldn't sustain that because it would draw back everything else I built. So we also need to leverage data-driven forecasting. We need to look at historical data. We need to look at industry benchmarks. We need to be able to project growth based on our current operating basis, as well as what the growth trajectory is, whether we are creating organic growth, we are buying growth, we are marketing for growth. What does that look like? And then we need to build a scalable business model. Sometimes what we're passionate about and what is needed is still not scalable. So evaluate what that demand looks like. Evaluate the opportunity. Evaluate the staff capacity. Evaluate the office space. Evaluate the operational systems. Plan it out. What would hiring look like? What would outsourcing? So the other day I was talking to a practice and they're the only practice in Oklahoma within 40 miles. 40 miles. How do you think staffing is for that? Staffing's hard when you're looking for specialties. So what we end up recognizing is that general approach in smaller communities might be more effective than specialty approach. These are all things we look at when we're measuring what our growth potential is. We want to enhance our marketing and networking. We want to invest in targeted marketing. How are we going to market and network where we can grow? And my viewpoint is I come back to supply and demand. What is the supply and what's the value of that supply? So if you've got 5 functional medical doctors and you've got a greater demand for functional medicine than the supply of doctors, you better be really specific on what payer mix you're going to bring into the equation. Because as you fill that supply, you want the greatest ROI for each unit of billable delivery. That's what business is. And so you want to look at how you're going to boost visibility to the payer mix that you're looking for. You want to recognize, how do we get from point A to point B in the most efficient, effective way? We need to monitor our cash flow and profitability when we're growing. Sometimes when we buy growth, we actually devastate our reservoir of money. And so ensuring financial health by tracking cash flow, profit margins, using budgeting tools to plan for investments and growth. What's new equipment? When will it be needed? What's our staff training? How do we maintain stability? Adapt to trends and feedback. You got to stay updated on your industry and your regulatory changes. What are the emerging patient care approaches and therapies? What are the new modalities? What are the new approaches to incorporate patient feedback to redefine and refine the way we support our community? We need also flexibility to ensure that we can be competitive and relevant. So I love strategic planning. We can create growth plans with milestones. We can review them, adjust them, bringing in performance data, optimizing your market shift. Consider consulting with a business coach or consultant who can even put that in front of you. And then I want you to invest in technology. Adopt tools like EHRs, telehealth, all those different things, but I want you to streamline the patient experience, recognizing that the greatest growth is a patient driven growth model. Patients are growing as you're driving growth to your practice. So, how do we analyze our potential growth? We need to conduct a demand and supply gap analysis, our supply demand gap analysis. We're going to survey, we're going to use public health data, we're going to identify unmet healthcare needs, we're going to identify the payer mix to it, we're going to look at wait times for appointments, we're going to gauge the demand and the overflow. What is a wait list versus an inquiry list? Your inquiry list is who wants services and doesn't do anything about it. Our wait list is people that are willing to put down action to be prioritized. Action may be intake, action may be deposits when you can regulatory do that, and it might be a dollar deposit, but it is some form of action that says, put me to the front of the line. Evaluate your payer mix and your reimbursement trends, looking at where insurance plans are dominating, looking at reimbursement rates, high demand areas, well reimbursed plans, and signaling your growth potential. This January 28th through the 31st, 2026, in Coral Gables, Florida, take your place in the front of the pack. The Growth Code Conference is your pole position. 4 days of expert-led workshops, high-performance business strategies, and powerful networking. Start fast, lead strong, finish first. Reserve your spot today at thegrowthcodeconference.com. So I want you to check with local providers. I want you to understand the shortage of in-network, and I want you to understand, where does your practice pivot? Where can they grow? Where do they go? What is the sustainability? And guess what? What is the risk to reward? What am I willing to leverage for opportunity? And is the juice worth the squeeze? So as we look at geographic and demographic expansion, we need to see if that culture is going to add to the general. Can we replicate what we do here somewhere else? So I just talked to my chief HR officer with one of the practices that we manage. And, we do fractional HR where we become your whole entire HR department. And so my chief HR officer was talking to me. He's like, Brandon, we're having issues. I'm like, okay, talk to me. He's like, for whatever reason, the culture in this demographic is totally different. I'm like, well, let's look at it. Is it census related? Is it employee related? Is it all those different attributes? And what we recognized was, we let the hires define the culture. We didn't bring the culture to the new opening because we got involved after the fact. So now we're dropping culture into this new clinic location to make sure that we're bringing what we have in other places into the new one. Sometimes that's important. So understanding your geographical area is really important, but funding, what does that look like? What's available? What does expansion look like? What are weather patterns in that expansion model? How does weather impact the growth trajectory? What does build out and facility costs look like? One of the things I like to do is I like to perform a workforce availability analysis. I want to estimate the staffing need to meet current and projected patient volumes and calculate provider to patient ratios, supplying what local labor market would look like and what kind of fees are needed to be able to be competitive in that market. So we're going to analyze our patient acquisition costs. We're going to look at our lifetime value. We're going to calculate where and how growth gets determined and how to execute growth in a timed basis. So I want to see 10% month over month, 20% then month over month, 30% month over month. How do we build a campaign of sustainability small to medium to large? Explore where your partnerships and your collaboration opportunities are going to be. Look at, hey, what are the organizations that are filtering in? Where is that demand? Where is there unmet healthcare? Where are people happy, not happy? So one of the things I sometimes do is I look at where are the happiest employees, where are the most unhappy employees, and what are they complaining about? And then I target that. So have you ever gone on Glassdoor and you ever looked at the worst reviews of employees in an area? And believe me, they may be toxic, but look at what they're complaining about and then start dropping ads in those areas for recruitment. And you'd be surprised sometimes. Now, yesterday's trash could be today's future. So just recognize what both is out there. When we're leveraging predictive analytics, we're able to look at the demand and we're able to forecast the potential. We're able to utilize predictive software. Health Catalyst is one that I like to forecast future patient demand and population growth, disease prevalence, seasonal trends, all of these. And we can cross reference also with projected provider retirements, relocations, and supply shortages. We are in the people business, and our people business is rooted in supply demand. Just because there's a supply does not mean there's a demand. Just because there's a demand doesn't mean there's a supply. So as we look at measuring potential growth, we also have to look at sustainability of growth. So we need to develop a growth capacity index. What does potential growth look like? Create an index that quantifies maximum growth by combining metrics. What is the market demand? What's the number of uninsured patients seeking care? What's their supply availability? What would open appointment slots look like? Timing, location, days? What is our funding potential? Available credit lines, grants, etc. How do we weigh each factor based on its impact? 50% demand, 30% supply, 20% funding. If we have a 50% demand, a 30% supply, and 20% funding, what is the opportunity in that expansion? 20%? We only have as much potential as the dollars available. So 20% funding, we wouldn't even utilize the 30% supply. So when I see 50% demand, 30% supply, and 20% funding, that tells me, hey, if I were to take 20% and I were to take 20% of the supply, 20%, which would be 20, we would take a majority of the supply available. Would that fill what we need? Let's score your practice's capacity and what that cost would be to bring that into equation. Now, when we look at sustainable growth, we need to adjust the index to account for constraints like staff burnout risk, patient satisfaction scores, cash flow volatility. We may look at a capped growth at a level where patient wait times remain under 2 weeks or staff overtime stays below 10 hours weekly. We need to look at all those things. Overtime can be beneficial, but it also can be a burnout. See, overtime allows people to make at a higher rate, and some people appreciate that, but people might have a higher burnout. Now, we'll talk about burnout in future episodes, but that is something to look at because burnout is a reflection of the quality of individual and where and what they need. What's burnout to me is different than burnout to you. That's different than burnout to your employee. So when we're building into this potential growth for sustainable growth, we're going to use scenario-based financial modeling. We're going to look at our potential growth. We're going to build financial models projecting revenue under a best case scenario. So do you remember what our funding was? 20%. So right now we're operating with a best case scenario based on that 20%. Sustainable growth. We're going to run conservative numbers. We're going to look at the scenarios and we're going to factor them based on delayed payments, shortages, regulatory changes, and ensure that the expenses don't exceed 70 to 80% of the revenue to maintain financial health. We need to ensure we have our 20 to 30% net margin in this game. And then we're going to use different between scenarios, setting realistic growth targets versus optimum growth targets. And we're going to prioritize the funding strategies that align with sustainable cash flow. Cash is queen, king, winner, winner, chicken dinner. And now we're going to implement a patient demand elasticity test. We're going to measure how sensitive patient demand is to changes in pricing and service offering and funding. So if we test a 10% fee increase, what's that going to do? We're going to look at new services in small cohorts. We're going to look at what uptick there is, and we're going to have high elasticity, which suggests strong growth potential, slow elasticity, um, or small elasticity would be more concerning. As we look at our sustainable growth model, we're going to monitor quality indicators, patient retention, what is our net promoter score, and how do we test to ensure changes don't erode the trust between us and our patient? As we use these findings to balance revenue growth with patient loyalty, we're able to ensure expansion doesn't compromise long term sustainability. We need to track our operational bottleneck. We need to look at the ratio of where that bottleneck is. Calculate the maximum patient load your practice can handle by analyzing your outputs and metrics, patient per provider per day. What is the appointment turnover time? We need to compare this to current demand and estimate untapped capacity. We need to identify what are bottlenecks. Maybe it's limited exam rooms, slow billing processes, and we need to measure the impact of that bottleneck over the course of time. Errors, patient complaints, and other issues. Set growth limits so that bottlenecks don't exceed 20% of your original operational capacity. And we need to address them with targeted investments, hiring, space allocation, and align potential growth with sustainable operations using funding to bridge gaps. As we move forward, we're going to conduct competitor benchmarking audits. We're going to look at competitors' growth rates, what their service expansions are, what is being done through capital and private equity versus what is being done privately, and how much market share. And we can use public data to find that and industry reports. Estimate your practice's potential and target your own trajectory. When we're benchmarking competitors, we're going to look at our operational metrics. So we're going to measure staff to patient ratios, patient satisfaction. We're going to identify sustainability, and then we're going to audit and set growth targets from that benchmark. As we move forward, we're going to apply risk adjusted growth forecasting. We're going to forecast what risk we're taking on as we grow and what our optimistic demand projections are. That can include population growth. That can include new referral streams. That can include maximum supply. How do we hire additional providers? How do we assume full access to funding? Maybe it's loans, grants, etc. So funding our growth versus the funding of what is paying for the services from patients. When we're building our risk adjusted growth, we're able to forecast our risk scores to variables. There's a 30% chance of reimbursement cuts. There's a 20% chance of staff shortages. There's a 50% turnover ratio, whatever that may be. And by using our risk adjusted forecasting, we're able to prioritize low risk growth if we want, ensuring funding is allocated for resilient initiatives, diversifying services over rapid hiring. Now we need to measure scalability with a pilot program. We need to launch small scale pilots, new clinics, new telehealth, new community based outreach to test demand and supply scalability. And I want you to track metrics like patient enrollment and revenue to project practice wide. So you see that component. Evaluate your pilot outcomes and look at your sustainable indicators. Only scale programs where qualitative and quantitative metrics align, using pilot results to calibrate your growth approach. So, in order to grow, we got a budget. And so we need to allocate our budget based on demand driven ROI. Prioritize investments in areas like high ROI driven by demand. So, for example, if data shows strong demand for telehealth and you have the funds and the funding sources to do that, build that as your prioritization. Build the virtual experience, the patient experience, train in it, and calculate the ROI by estimating revenue connected to that new create. Dedicate 20 to 30% of your budget to the high ROI initiatives and reserve the rest of operational stability, payroll, rent, etc., using a rolling budget to adjust your allocations quarterly based on demand shifts. We need to ensure investments don't strain your cash reserves and create a 3-month operating buffer to maintain that financial stability. Then we need to create a tiered investment plan for supply expansion. We need to develop a phased plan to address supply constraints, tier one low cost solutions, and all the part-time contractor employee, all those different things, mid-range investments, hiring our full-time staff, and then our higher cost expansions with new leases, etc. We allocate funds incrementally so that we're starting with 10 to 15% of revenue for tier one and we're scaling. As we grow, it grows, and we have sustainability checks and balances. So then we want to implement our funding diversification strategy. We don't want to put all our eggs in one basket. So don't just build Medicaid. Look at how we're going to diversify across multiple streams, grants, lines of credits, all different ways to both fund it as well as our funding sources that we connect to. Build a zero based budgeting for growth initiatives. Build your budget from scratch each year, justifying every growth related expense based on current demand, supply, risk to reward. What is the juice? What is the squeeze? Let's make it happen. Let's prioritize high ROI and look at where our measuring our risk is in comparison to that. And then we need to invest in modular infrastructure. So focus investments on growth from a diagnostic tools, expandable operations, subscription-based software, and where that is. And then we need to establish our growth reserve fund. Don't grow until you're ready. Grow in parallel to opportunity tied to reserve funds. And we need to leverage our cost benefit analysis for technology investments. Evaluate technology like AI driven scheduling, patient engagement apps. I'm a big believer in this MSO world. Have one admin team supporting 50 clinics. I can bring you 50 clinics worth of staff. That idea of one MSO, you can create your own MSO. And that way, we're utilizing technology and we're leveraging not the same receptionist in every clinic we open. And so, utilizing technology, utilizing MSO, and budgeting that your admin is going down in ratio to revenue as you expand your provider delivery system. And we're allocating 5 to 15% of the budget for technology advancement, and we're prioritizing solutions with proven cost savings. So, all of these are ways to invest and sustain in your growth trajectory. Did you know a 2023 SBA report indicated that small businesses with a defined growth trajectory plan to grow 52% faster than those without? 66% have reported increased market share as a result. If you can't see it, you can't be it. So Yogi Berra said, if you don't know where you are going, you'll end up someplace else. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the Private Practice Survival Guide podcast. Don't forget, tune in, subscribe, like us, do all the things you know that I want, because together we can thrive, not just survive. Thank you for tuning in to the Private Practice Survival Guide podcast. I'm incredibly grateful to each and every one of you. Exciting news. We're now available everywhere, from Spotify to Apple Podcasts to YouTube or anywhere you like to listen to your podcasts. So watch, listen, and reach out. If you love this episode, please drop a 5-star review. It truly means the world to me. Are you looking for more ways to elevate your practice? If so, now is your chance. Reach out, go to my website, or email me at brandon@wellnessworksmp.com. And remember, it's not just about surviving, it's about thriving.